start. So good. So good morning. We're not going to wait for all the late Californians. Yeah. So the program for this morning is the first part. Till the break will be panel. Then after the break it will be open. And then the closing session in the afternoon will be mostly panel and some open. So, and we're still open to change, but that's what we propose. Yeah. So I have to recollect. So a few things. So I try to somehow put my own, what I took out of the last 2 days. And of course we have to maybe first state that the intent is to apply for the Krishnamurti Foundation is the intent to apply some rigor into the whole discussion around the spiritual aspects of life and Krishnamurti's teachings. And what the best thing we have so far is the scientific rigor, and maybe we'll find different rigors, but and of course, as the speakers Patik and Donald have already pointed out, science doesn't prove anything, but can fail to disprove, and that's and I think for the moment that's good enough. I think I would like to add something to that. What Bertrand Russell talked about, that he said, well, if you make an outrageous statement, you suddenly you have to back that up somewhat. The onus is on you to back it up. So he said it around the teapot, the famous teapot. If you make a statement that there's an invisible teapot flying around the earth, then you have to somehow back that up with something and don't make a statement that's outrageous. So, and I feel that's important because especially in the realm of spirituality, you can make claims that are not necessarily untrue, but they're so way out there that besides you owning the claim and making the claim, that we cannot, besides me believing you, would be the only basis of finding any common ground, which is so, and that's not sufficient, I feel, for the rigor we want to put out here. So that's the first bit. Then the other thing that we have looked at is that the best thing that we have so far is evolution. The theory of evolution, or the process of evolution, or I don't know, and that somehow what we look at, that even Krishnamurti's teachings, and we're not saying it is consistent with the theory of evolution, but at least we're trying to, if we find any deviations from the theory of evolution, we're very explicit about it. But so far I haven't seen those. It would also be really, will be interesting if we find really deviations from that. So for the moment we're looking at the domain consistency with Darwinian evolution. I assume that there are other ways of looking at evolution, which is random variation and adaptation, and natural selection. So because I just make that explicit because these are choices that I made, and it's good to make these choices consciously. And it's not that if you deviate from these choices that there's anything that there's anything wrong with that. But for the moment, that's the playing field that we're on. And even if it's untrue, just to take these point of views till the furthest we can go might in itself give us new insights or new perspectives on how to look at things. So we're not saying what is true or false, it's just it's a way of applying rigor to what we're looking at. Um, so yeah, and then and Donald, of course, he spoke a lot about perception and how perception and we have Krishnamurti's words about perception, direct perception, and from the two ways of looking, at the moment they seem to be irreconcilable, right? I mean, if perception is construction in the brain of data, then direct perception, we don't really know from that point of view what direct perception means. It doesn't mean that there's nothing out there, but so far, so that I feel is an open question here that we haven't tackled. We have tackled perception from the knowledge that we know about perception, that it's limited, that it's a construction, and and therefore it's limited. But then how to make to look at Krishnamurti's statement about direct perception, we haven't covered that ground yet. So I feel that's also maybe an important thing to keep in mind, that there's no reconciliation there, and not that we have to agree or that it has to be true again, but it's good to see how far we can push it in either direction, and then see what is left of it. So I would say that's also a question that's open. And there's another thing that I want to bring out. Yeah, okay. So, so perception, awareness, and observation. So these words are sometimes used synonymously in Krishnamurti's work. And then is that, and if I look from the Krishnamurti point of view, from the Krishnamurti's teachings point of view, as far as I understand it, how he uses that as awareness without any prior knowledge, observation without interference of thought, so a direct perception, which he claims is possible. Is that then inconsistent with anything we've seen so far from evolution, or the human models that have been presented, or what Patik presented about the biological nature, how we biologically have been come into being. Now, and it would of course be strange if we talk about freedom, if we talk about, if we explore if it's possible not to observe without prior knowledge, if that is possible, that suddenly a feature will come into being which hasn't shown its face already in the previous part of evolution. I mean, it would be strange that suddenly something new would come in. So is it so that we're overlooking something in what is already happening, or is there something, okay, if the human being is able to observe without prior knowledge, that something new comes into being? Or is this feature already showing its face, but somehow we don't know how to look at that? And I would at least try to put out the possibility, or the angle, because that Krishnamurti, at least at two places, in his work, in two places, claims that there are glitches in the matrix, and the one glitch is, so what happens in the gap between two thoughts? So is the space between thoughts, is that just emptiness where the system is shut down? It's equivalent to death. An entity that doesn't live anymore. Or is in those moments in between two thoughts, there is somehow an observation that is not colored by prior knowledge. So the gap between thoughts, that's one thing. So that's the first glitch that he somehow mentions. And there's another glitch that he somehow mentions, and that's that when you look at something, at beauty, like he says, he has many quotes about mountains where you're in the presence of a huge mountain, that's for a moment the brain silences, and then afterwards you start to recollect and say, well, this is a beautiful mountain, but that there's a gap between the presence of beauty, or the majesty of a mountain, as he often calls it, where there's somehow a moment where you, where there's a space which has no knowledge, and then knowledge comes in and tries to frame it as, I like the mountain, or this is not, it's beautiful light, it's beautiful green, etc. So these are the two glitches that I would just like to bring in as possibilities to look at as glitches in the matrix, but also that these might be indicators that that there are many more moments in our day-to-day life, but they are not things, like the absence of things, and we only seem to be remember things. We remember a particular experience, a particular knowledge, but we are not wired to recollect where there's no thing. So that might be just because we don't know how to look. That might be more a problem of that we don't look in that area, in that realm, and oversee something. But our day might have many moments, right? It's like, yeah, I think this is where I would like to leave it for the moment, just to kick us off and see what the various. So we start with the panel and then we go to the rest.
I don't know if you mind. Just, I mean, there's a lot to respond to, but I have a few thoughts. One is more of a general one, and I thought just to use the word because Jaap brought it up. Just in terms of our conversation, if we almost take the opportunity to just redefine what we even mean by spiritual, in the sense that given we can probe and try to have scientific insights, what does it mean? What do those mean for our lives actually? So in terms of how we live our life, and how do our insights into what it is that we are inform our lives actually somehow? If that could be like a tentative definition of what we mean by spiritual, just to. I more just put that in a way of framing. So as we've covered a lot of ground in terms of even radically shifting what it is, space-time, what does that mean for our lives, and how does that inform how we live? So just as a general way in terms of how we somehow today try to synthesize or integrate or understand what it means, what gathering insights mean, but beyond just conceptually in living. And then the other thing I want to point out that I think would be an interesting point to discuss is this idea of perception and direct perception. Somehow to bring out that Krishnamurti proposes that the value and the action of perception really is in the act of perceiving, that perceiving itself has a quality that's valuable, that the value isn't in what's perceived. So whether or not what's perceived is quote unquote true or false is one question, but can we look at or try to understand what this value of perception as perception is, without placing the value on whether or not what it sees is a true representation of reality or not. So sort of, that's one question, that's a valid question, but there's another question, which is there any way to unpack that, this intrinsic value to perception as perception? Whether, yeah, just as a open question in terms of what we're discussing. Yeah.
So are we sort of just listing questions or also responding, or right now?
Maybe could list and yeah, I don't know what the format is, but have you a proposal what would be most effective?
Wasn't thinking about it, but I'll just respond to a couple of things. So Yap said that as far as he knows, there isn't a discrepancy between the theory of evolution and Krishnamurti on the issue of evolution, and I do see discrepancies in a couple of areas in my reading of Krishnaji. I mean, I don't need to describe them, but I do see discrepancies. I don't see how I understand Krishnamurti as being consistent with the theory of evolution in certain things. In terms of the issue of direct perception, at least for me, the feeling, and it's certainly been helped by discussions with people, and very much so by the presentations of the last 2 days. From Krishnamurti's discussions, it doesn't seem that the issue of perception has to do with the degree of reality or not of the object being perceived. But it has to do, the word direct seems to be more related to, if you will, for want of a better word, the interference that's being produced in the act of looking at something, specifically by this concept of the me or the I, not by other things, not by the construction of things in the visual cortex or the auditory cortex, or none of that. Doesn't seem to mind any of that, or he probably didn't know about any of that. But the so-called interference really does seem to be with an aspect of the self, not even the whole self, not the monitoring of the body internally and its states and boundaries and any of that, but that sense of the me or the I as a permanent entity. That's something, from where the looking's happening and to whom things are being done. So that's my feeling in terms of the word direct in the term direct perception. And I don't need to go into it now, but if people are interested, I'm happy to share some what I think are some really cool technological devices that are out there that apparently some people claim make a huge difference in understanding and seeing the activity of the self, just like people have talked about microdosing with psychedelics, and there are 2 or 3 other things out there that don't involve psychedelics that have
I'm eager.
so after we go around with the questions, if someone's and maybe even this gap between 2 thoughts, if I talk about that, maybe I'll have something to say about that. So anyway, so those are just some comments.
No, why don't you go ahead and...
No, you.
Oh, okay. That was a great tease. Very good points that we want to inject rigor. It's easy to make claims, and we would like to understand if those claims are valid, if there's some reason to believe them. I also agree with the point that rigor for its own sake could just be rigor mortis, right? Right. Consciousness is a very living, dynamic thing. It's very alive, and there is a question, why desiccate it into mathematics and science and so forth? It's a living being, and I think the reason for that is something else that you brought up, Jaap, which is it's very easy for us to think that we know what we're talking about, to make claims. And one thing that we've learned in cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, is that we are easily self-deceived. And we easily generate stories about why we're behaving, about how other people behave, that turn out to be just utterly false. And so we really do need a rigorous give and take of ideas, informally, and then of theories and experiments more formally, that can allow us to come out of the places where we might go that are just, we thought we knew what we were talking about, and we don't. And if you look back at human history, we have a good track record of being consistently wrong, right? It's quite consistent. Pretty much everything that we deeply believed and were even willing to kill people over turned out to be deeply false. And so we know that very, very bright people, well-intentioned, can believe something very, very deeply, even to the point where they feel like they have a moral obligation to kill people who disagree with them. And it turns out later on that they had made elementary mistakes. And so we have to be very, very careful ourselves not to fall into that trap. And that's one point for just informal dialogue, but also for scientific discussion. But I also agree that when we pursue this in a rigorous way, it shouldn't just be an academic exercise just for the purpose of making points, winning arguments, and so forth. There is the practical side. How do we live out what we've learned? So I'll say a couple things in terms of maybe clarifying this direct perception versus claims elsewhere that maybe perception is not direct, and what is Krishnamurti saying? And again, I don't know what Krishnamurti meant, but I'll put out some ideas that we can then play with. There is a history in the philosophy of science called logical positivism, in which they assumed, this is about a century ago, that there were certain aspects of perception that were absolutely direct, that we were infallible. So the raw perception of color, or shades of gray. The idea was that these were the incorrigible foundations of knowledge. You could not be wrong. This was what nature gave you, the raw, direct data. Anything that you built up after that involved inferences. So when I actually see a table that's brown, that's going beyond just the raw sensations of light and dark and color and so forth. Those raw sensations were incorrigible. I could not be wrong about them. They were direct. But any inferences I built on that, that's where I got inductive risk, and that's where we could make mistakes. That had a good run for a few decades, and it turned out not to work. But it was very, very influential for many, many decades. And my field has come along, cognitive neuroscience, and looked at what those philosophers thought were direct foundations of perception. Raw colors, raw shades of gray. And yesterday, one reason I showed you that hat with the yellow patch in the front and the brown patch on the side, and if you didn't know any different, you would swear they, not formally, but informally, that they were different colors. But then you can actually show that the RGB values are identical between the two. So here's a case where we think that we're, in fact, very brilliant philosophers. I mean, these were guys who had IQ, 50 points more IQ than me. I mean, they were brilliant, but they were deeply wrong about the perception. And then I showed you that little cube with a line down the middle, and it looks dark on the top and light on the bottom, and you put your finger, and all of a sudden you realize, whoa, my perception even of the raw shades of gray is not direct perception. There's something really sophisticated going on there. It's inferential. And it turns out it's very sophisticated inferential processing that's going on there, even in the most simple aspects of perception. And this is not a personal practical application, but it turns out one practical application that is coming to a car near you very soon is visually guided automatic driving cars with cameras on board. If you tried to build a driverless car that can see the world under the assumption that you just have direct perception, it will not work. It just won't. So there's a technological thing here. If you propose direct perception, then what I come back to you with is, okay, great. Build a driverless car based on direct perception. Let's see you do it. That's sort of the hard-nosed scientific attitude. We can do it using very sophisticated inferential processes. And if you look at what's going on in those cars, it is nasty, nasty, complex inferential processes that's going on there. And that's what works. So now when Krishnamurti talks about being with, what is directly and so forth, clearly it's not this kind of direct perception that the logical positivists were talking about, because that's clearly false. And I don't think that Krishnamurti is saying something that's false and dumb. I think there's something deep there. So as I've been thinking about the other tools that we have in cognitive neuroscience that might start to deal with this, one is the various functional networks in the human brain. And it turns out there's something called the connectome. Right, so your brain has 86 billion, 86 billion neurons. But those neurons in various parts of the brain have these big highways of information that travel back and forth between different parts of the brain. And so that connectivity, we can use something called diffusion tensor imaging to actually image all the highways in the brain. And we have found that there are tight correlations between the big highways and the functional connections that we see. If this area of the brain is active, then this one is also active in a correlated fashion. And those are sort of the functional networks. And it turns out you have quite a few different functional networks in the way your brain operates. And this has sort of come out in the last 20 years. And one of the first ones that was really discovered, it was hinted at maybe even 50 years ago by the guy who invented EEG, but it's really sort of come into its own in the last 20 years, is the default mode network. And this is the network that seems to be active when you're daydreaming, not really focusing on anything, when you're obsessing about yourself, when you're obsessing about social relations, and that network is sort of the chatter monkey. If I was going to say what in spiritual traditions when we talk about the little monkey that's chattering all the time and that you want to quiet down, I think a good candidate, and this is just a hypothesis, is that what is the activation of the default mode network, which is the cognitive neuroscience correlate of what we're talking about, this chattering monkey. It's obsessing about me, my social relationships, how do I look, and then it's also, when I'm not doing that, it's just wandering around. And, it's there for a good evolutionary purpose. It's really important for me to worry about my interactions with other people because otherwise I might be inappropriate. And it's good to have all sorts of wandering ideas. I love doing that. That's where I get a lot of my scientific ideas. I get a lot of nonsense, but maybe 1 out of 1,000,000 is good, and so I keep it. It turns out that there are other networks in the brain whose activation automatically suppresses the activation of the default mode network, and vice versa. It's really, so they're reciprocally connected. One being activated automatically turns the other one down. And it turns out it's one of the most powerful ones are the perceptual attention networks. Visual attention, somatosensory attention, auditory attention. If you actually activate those networks, you automatically tamp down the default mode network. So here's one proposal, a practical proposal, and also it leads to perhaps a practical way that we could use this in our own meditation. When you actually choose to focus on, I'm now going to attend to the red color of that rose and the green color of the vase and the gloss on the glass, and to listen to Corey's cup being put on the table. I'm listening to all this auditory stuff. So when I choose to let my attention go into also how my body is feeling, what we know you're doing is you're activating these networks, the visual, auditory, and somatosensory attention networks, and we know that that automatically quiets the default mode network. So perhaps when Krishnamurti is saying to have a direct perception of what is, and walk away from all, in some sense, the chatter, I'm not quoting him, I'm putting him in my own words. It could be that there's this very interesting, fairly new neuroscience insight that corresponds precisely to what he's saying. And that the words direct, that, I as a cognitive scientist would say, okay, now there's this technical meaning of direct, and of course it's not that, there's inferential stuff going on there. That's, I think, I want to look past that language difference and say maybe what he was pointing to was, look, when I'm just trying to be with awareness of sensory information, whatever that means, and it turns out that's very sophisticated, what it's doing is walking away from all the chatter of the default mode network. So that's one thing, and that also then gives us tools that you actually know that it's just the way you're wired. If I choose to attend to the red of the rose, I will quiet down the monkey that's chattering. That's what happens. And so it actually gives you tools that you actually know you can use. And I've been playing with this because I've had this idea for a little while, and what I find is as I add more and more sensory networks into what I'm attending to, I can be aware of my hands and my legs, so that's somatosensory. Now and I was doing this last night, now can I also be aware of the sounds in the room? And can I be aware of, my eyes are closed, just the feeling of gray that I feel when my eyes are closed? Be aware of that, be aware of and the more I allow myself to go into these various modes of awareness, the more the chatter just disappears. And so this gives you a tool to play with. It gives you a scientific background to think about this, and you can play with it. And I think it would be fun to do this not just informally, but I think also in scientific experiments. This could be actually something that we could do where we could measure how you could specifically choose to have your attention in various ways, see how much the activation of those sensory networks tamps down the default mode network. And and we could do this with really, advanced meditators who say, now I'm really in the state of silence, and look what's going on with the default mode network and so on. And perhaps that's already being done. I wouldn't be surprised in some sense from the point of view of my field. What I'm saying is so obvious that it perhaps has already been done. So I should pass it on.
No, I can. She takes your time and I go.
There's two things one thing that one thing you mentioned, and you sort of started there, and is in the sense that often we're wrong about ourselves or about the world. Which in itself may just be a fact of our limited ability to understand. But what seems to be problematic is that when we're wrong, often even if we're given the information that we're wrong, we're unwilling to be wrong or to admit we're wrong. So that seems to go sort of back to this whole deal about knowledge and how we relate to the world. It isn't benign, our feelings of understanding the world and how we interpret the world and how we interact with it. So it's something that came up to me when you were mentioning that, this whole thing about part of the issue with our knowledge about ourselves and the world is that when it's wrong, often we're unwilling to allow that to be the case. So that's just a point that I think is interesting, just to bring that in. Yeah, and the other bit is this: it's really interesting to, as you sort of walked through, moving and attempting to attend to your sensory experience. And I guess just a question about that is whether or not included in that there's a possibility to attend to my own desire to attend, that it includes much more than just attending to sensory experience, but also attending to my desire to do so and the motivations to do so. So then it moves closer to questioning what even the choice to do so, what is that about? And because I think that in terms of Krishnamurti's work, it would say that even the choice to attend to one's environment is often an attempt to move away from some. So if it's the chatter, my attempt to attend to the environment is my attempt to escape from the chatter. So even to look at that whole process as an activity, that somehow even if there may be real value in attention, but my desire for attention should also somehow be understood, because that it may also still be, in some sense, a way that I'm perpetuating myself as one that attends to be free of my own nonsense or something like that. So just to bring that out, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to pick up a little bit where we were yesterday, and I think Pratik brought out how belief had such an important factor in cooperation of the society, and so now the larger question here, so not being free. I don't think we have defined freedom completely yet, but assuming that there is something, a domain that is free, a potentiality of free, whatever that then might be, where we have some notion of, is not being free, does that serve a useful purpose? And if we would eliminate, so if we would be free, certain actions will not be happening anymore. Like now we can start with cooperation. That kind of cooperation, which is coming out of belief, is then not possible anymore. It's not happening anymore. So on a societal level, then we have to wonder how would cooperation come about if you would not collaborate anymore around an idea or a belief or an identity? And it's actually interesting. I mean, just from a contemporary point of view, at the moment, the whole thing about identity seems to be spiking up in an extreme way. Like identity is becoming more and more important. I mean, belief seems to be really becoming less important. But there are all kinds of other ways that we seem to be grouping ourselves. And then at universities, there's whole battles about different parties within the university. So but how would we? What would be a kind of cooperation? I mean, no. So the bigger question will: are there more areas that would not function anymore if we would be free, or not function in the same way anymore if we would be free? And then second, take the example of collaboration. What would collaboration be like? How would we collaborate, and how would we effectively collaborate and work together if it would not be around an idea, belief, or an identity? I don't know who would like to pick up that question. No.
First is I don't know, but I can talk about some of the aspects of human nature that we've learned in cognitive neuroscience that are at play here that may help us understand what's going on in group cooperation. One of the things we've discovered is that we don't know our own motivations very well, and we really are not aware of our desires. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't spend time examining ourselves. We should. And we should question our motives and look at our desires and so forth. But the assumption that we all, myself included, naively bring to this is that in some sense I'm the authority. When I look inside, I'm the authority. And one reason I showed that display yesterday where I flashed an image, then a blank screen, another image, is myself and everybody, we're all confident that we know that we're seeing this room in high resolution. We just know that. It's not a question. And we're just flat out wrong. We're just flat out wrong. And I don't think that's the exception. I think that's the rule. And so here's a case where I think it's very important for us to understand our motives in how we interact in groups, why we interact in groups, and the desires that we have. But it's going to be a case where introspection can only take you so far, and we have to be very, very careful that introspection can be systematically misleading. I mean, systematically on the basics. Which is, again, not to say don't do introspection, but we need to have checks and balances on it. So for example, in the area of desire, the theory of evolution gives us some interesting tools to predict desires that you might not know you have. And so I'll give an example of one that I actually predicted about 10 years ago. The theory of evolution predicts that males are looking for youth and health in females. And any signature of that will create desire. Females are looking for health, not as much youth, and evidence of social status in males as key things. And I'm talking straight right now. The work on gays is interesting but not as sophisticated yet. And so I was studying the eye, because we look at faces more than any other object in our lifetime, and we look at the eyes more than anything else. And I thought, surely the eyes will have cues to youth and health that would be triggers of desire. And so I started studying images of eyes, and I noticed something in the eye that I didn't even know what it was called. It's called the limbal ring. So where the colored iris of your eye meets the white of the eye. If you look closely at some people, you'll see a dark annulus right at the border. And if you have really dark eyes, you can't see it. But I noticed in looking at photographs that this limbal ring, this dark annulus around the iris, was really distinct and thicker on average in infants. And as I looked at older and older people, I noticed that it was less apparent and thinner on average. Not perfectly. There are some adults with very thick limbal rings and some children with less. But all you need in evolution statistically is a small correlation for evolution to pick it up. So I predicted, and this is so I'm using evolution by natural selection not to tell you a just so story about what happened a million years ago. I'm making a new prediction about an experiment that's never been done, and I'm putting the theory on the line. So evolution is not just a tool to talk about what may have happened to people hunting and gathering millions. I was making a new prediction, and we tested. So what we did was we did an experiment. I would take photographs of people, nice clean photographs, put two identical photographs side by side, but in one we would have edited in clean, clear limbal rings, and the other not. And in the experiment, all we had to do, all the subjects did, they were sitting at a computer, we'd say, on each trial, we're going to show you two faces, just point to the one, click on the one, that's more attractive. So we'd start off, and the subjects would go, this is silly, they're the same face. There's no difference. And we'd say, please, just humorous, just randomly pick the one that feels most attractive. And they systematically, without knowing what was going on, picked the one with the distinct limbal ring. Here's a case where when you introspect, you have no idea that you have a desire for one and not the other. And you have no idea what's triggering that desire. And this is just one example. This is not the exception, it's the rule. We have thousands of these triggers that are pulling our desires left and right all over the place. We don't know what they are. And we think that we do, and we don't. We're like the beetle, the jewel beetle on that bottle. We're sure we're mating with a female, and we're not. We're being pulled by these random cues. One practical thing, I've consulted for companies, and as you can imagine, once you know these cues, in their advertisements, I help them actually make their models more attractive. I actually know, I gave you one, I've done lots of experiments, I actually know many, many cues now that you would say, I have no idea. One is this wasn't something I discovered, someone else, pupil dilation. So when you are interested in somebody, attracted to them, your pupil will dilate a little bit. Also, if you're doing a calculus problem, your pupil will dilate a little bit.
What problem?
Calculus. Mathematics. So if you're doing really hard cogitation. But if it's a person in a candlelit room smiling at you and the pupils are dilating, the chances are they're not doing calculus, right? So you can make a fair inference. So in one very clever experiment, they had a psychology textbook that they made available for people to pick up and buy. And on the front of the cover was a beautiful woman's face, big image of her face. And they had two versions of it. In one, they'd slightly dilated the pupils, and the other, not. And they just had a bunch of men randomly, and the men all were looking around, and they just sort of liked to pick the ones where the woman's eyes had pupils that were dilated. They had no idea what they were doing, but they were just looking around and, this one just feels better, and they took that. And so once again, we have, and I can say, if you ask the person to introspect why, you could introspect for 1,000 years, you would never figure out why. And in fact, it's only in the context of a scientific theory and then these careful experiments that we can begin to unmask the various layers of desire. So again, I don't want to say that this is instead of our own work, introspection. But working together, we can actually take the insights from cognitive neuroscience where we begin to understand all the layers of desire and all the unconscious processing that's going on. Unconscious in the sense that you have no awareness that it's going on. And it's pushing you around, and you have no idea what's pushing you around. I do find, knowing this stuff, it really helps me to accept myself. Don, give yourself a break. There are thousands of things pushing you around you just don't know about. Relax. Go with it. Of course, don't be inappropriate. But if you find these desires coming and going, actually take it, for me as a scientist, take it as an interesting research project. Why is it? Well, what's going on here? Okay, instead of beating myself up about it, let's go into this. It's a different way of going into it. I like what Krishnamurti says. Let's go into this, and we should go into it in terms of as much as we can conceptually and in terms of introspection and so forth. But I do want to say that I think that will take you to good places, and then it has an absolute limit. And there are places that you cannot go that way that are true about your desires and your motivations. So I should not dominate. I'll carry on.
I'll try to sort of pull some of this together in the way I see it or I'm responding now, and I want to say I'll try to be brief. So
it's 10:28, so you have 2 minutes. No,
so, so starting from the
I think it would be good. I was just thinking also about it. It's like if we can somehow also, while we're doing it, somehow raise questions or something, or things that we want to bring in, discuss in the next hour, and also that we somehow want to work on in the last hour. So I just, as that, we have that as a problem. I'm sure you will do that. It's maybe good to.
no, you're not sure I'll do that, but so Krishnamurti often asked what will bring about a radical change, and he used words like mutate your brain cells, and allowing for the language. We sort of get the point, or we think we do, and of the question, that is, not know the answer. And talked about often a quote-unquote a tremendous energy that's required for this. So of course he also presented an alluring portrait of some tremendous energy that one has access to after there's freedom, but also talked about the energy needed to go into this. Then I've heard some discussions, I don't know if it's from Krishnamurti, that the brain has many more capabilities than we use because we quote-unquote waste energy. Raman says this a lot, like we waste energy in this and that. And so the implication is that if we stop doing that, then maybe we'd have more energy to available to us. And won't give you a lecture about the brain and energy and so on, but just in a single sentence say there's no evidence that the brain has more capabilities that are somehow hidden and not being used, because evolution is very frugal and it won't put something in place and then not use it. It only puts in things in place or preserves that which seems to be necessary. So now, with that as a preamble, going to tools and technology, we know that while the brain develops over thousands, millions of years and comes up with new technologies and they have implications, but we know that the direction of the impact of the new technology on the brain always has been much, much, much bigger. and affecting a much bigger population with tool use, with fire, with all the other things. So if the brain gets rest, if you will, or if parts of the brain don't need to be used because technologies now do that, then that's one very promising avenue. Maybe not for us in our lifetime, but thinking more generally. We know the brain monitors.
I'm not sure I really understood that last point. Maybe if I didn't, maybe others did.
The maybe a simple example would be something like, even 20 or 30 years ago, when information wasn't on the internet and wasn't curated, if Don had this idea about features of faces and what they correspond to, today he could look up what he needs to look up in 10 or 15 minutes with some keywords. But even as short as 20 or 25 years ago, he might have had to spend, a good 20 or 30 hours in a library looking at journals, looking at titles of articles, reading abstracts, going through things. It would have been a very long, laborious process, assuming that the knowledge base is the same. So forget about the 20 years of new knowledge. Forget about that for a minute. So to explore that idea, or at least explore what's out there and what others have said or not said, and so on. I mean, that's just a simple example. So all of that time and effort and energy. There's this interesting calculation someone's made, and I can't vouch for the veracity of the calculation, but it sounds reasonable. That about 200 or 300 years ago, if you wanted by human effort to purchase 1 hour of artificial light, which is a candle, so if you wanted to have available to you 1 hour of light when it's dark, you had to do the equivalent of about 8 or 10 hours of work. That's what it took the average human to do to earn enough to be able to purchase 1 hour of light. And today, globally, not in the US, globally, which includes all the poor people in Africa, it's a small fraction of a second of work that we have to do to purchase 1 hour of artificial light. That talks to the gain of efficiency which has been afforded by technology, which then means that you have 7.999 hours to do other things compared to just 200 years ago for the ability to have 1 hour of artificial light. That's the gain in efficiency that 200 years have seen. That is because of technology, not because the brain has changed or your work is so much more valuable. It's not because your work is so much more valuable or your time is so much more. Like, I can give you more for 7 hours than I could then. Anyway, that there's so many examples. So then that allows the brain to do other things. And so if there's a room to be more creative, then it allows for that. It wouldn't allow for that 200 years ago when it wasn't relevant, being more creative, the variation in that. But I want to get to this stuff and not go on, but we can.
But you seem to leave us hanging there. It seems that you're saying, yes, we could more creative, but it's almost like you're saying, and we have not become creative.
No, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you some things that are around the corner that are happening. So we all know this thing between introspection and looking outside. I mean, we've known for a long time that the brain is monitoring basically two environments, the environment inside us and outside us. And it's absolutely no surprise that when something strong happens, then more of the attention shifts there. If I have an unexpected pain right now inside my body, and it's very likely that a lot of my attention will shift there, and then I'll be less attentive to the rose and all that. And I won't notice it as much. And similarly, when I come across a majestic mountain, it's no surprise at all that the attention goes there, when, particularly if it was unexpected, and then there's less of the me in the monitoring and the sense of that. That's neither here nor there, and that doesn't help with the silence issue, I don't think. That's and surely a solution for not having a strong sense of me is not to constantly be looking outside and focusing with the shift in these networks. I mean, surely that's not. So what I want to just tell you all about is two things, and I'll really try to be quick. One of the difficulties with understanding and being in touch with the sense of the me or the self is it's hidden. I mean, we don't need to talk about the difficulties there, but simple things give us some clues, and I get into this virtual reality thing. Like, for instance, we're never used to seeing ourselves, what we look like, from all angles, which is why we usually don't like photographs of ourselves, but we see nothing wrong in looking at photographs of other people. And that's just one example. We hate the sound of our own voice because to ourselves we sound very different than when we hear it on a tape. And there are reasons for that I won't go into. So the ability to look at oneself, quote unquote look, quote unquote more objectively, is really becoming easier now. And that takes off on the virtual reality thing, where you can wear this stuff, this helmet or whatever, that, and for those of you who are interested, I'll share, and I've already shared with several of you a long article that was in the New Yorker 3 or 4 months ago on this, called Real Virtuality instead of Virtual Reality, where the virtuality is becoming more real rather than the other way around. So in this, they talked about one of the things that they're doing, and this is in fact people with PTSD and so on, and they're finding very, very interesting results. You wear the thing, and of course these virtual reality things are so good that after 5 or 10 minutes you really think you're in that world. Like you're watching a baseball game. For the first 5 minutes, you know you're just wearing something and watching it like you're watching a TV, but with that kind of experience, the majority of people within 5-10 minutes forget that and think they're actually in a stadium watching a game, a live game. It's very, very good, and it works with the majority of people. And then so I'm sitting in a room wearing that thing with you, cameras are pointing at me, but I don't see that. And initially I'm told I'm going to have a conversation with you. It's actually an image of you. And somebody else asks questions and I answer, and I ask you questions. And then afterwards, they say, now you ask the question and give the answer to yourself, but when I'm answering, I look at you and I see you. When I have to create the question, I see you sitting there. You're not even there. And I'm asking the question, and they do a sound thing that changes the... And they say you can get into conversations with yourself, with nobody there, with this, that are astounding, and they claim that it's a breakthrough as much as these psychedelics and other things, about understanding the nature of the me by having a conversation with me that you could never ever have by introspection or sitting down. So one example. Now extending on that and going to your field of visual perception, there was another article, it was beautiful. It started with the problem of a camera caught an accident at a distance, saw a car hit a pedestrian, and they couldn't read the number plate. The resolution wasn't good enough. And there's nothing they could do to improve it. It just was what it was. So they did a deep learning, and instead of trying to figure out the license plate, with the same camera at the same distance, they made it read 5,000 number plates, right? Not read, but the same fuzzy picture. No more clear, but then as you know, they could very easily with deep learning read with crystal clarity. Now, with that kind of chip, if the visual cortex, which is half the brain or whatever, is involved in the computation in order to see with clarity, it is not at all a stretch that you can have a visual cortex on a chip that you can carry in your pocket or put in your brain, as they've done for areas of the motor cortex. And what that would do is it would, in principle, give you the same clarity of vision, but open up half your brain to do other things if it so chose to do. Because as you've shown us, with theory, I mean, I'm stretching it a bit, but they are doing this now. Not to open up half your brain for introspection and learning about them. That's not the purpose. They're doing it with people who had accidents, with problems, with people who've lost a limb, and they're putting an artificial limb, and the even more difficult computation I've heard is locomotion, even more than vision and so on, and they're very successful. So I sort of stopped there, but there absolutely are things that are round the corner that will open the door, among other things, to freeing up tremendous portions of the brain without compromising our ability to do what we do today, or to do it as well. That then may open the door for some of these. I'll sort of stop.
I don't know, do we want to pause?
Yeah,
Okay.
quarter two.
Okay.
Time for
Yeah.
a break and coffee and tea.
Pause for